We're going to be focusing on zimun, which is when a group of people are going to be doing Birchat Hamazon, which is the precursor or invitation before the Birchat Hamazon is said. So we're gonna start with a overview that will cover many of the things that we're going to be talking about in more specific detail today, to some of the kind of laws and customs as regards to zimun. A lot of it's going to be appearing on Daf 45, as well as a Daf Nun, that's 50, a sprinkle between 45 and 50 as well. Much that will be ahead of us, I will, if I mention at all, I will just briefly note, but we'll come back to it in much greater detail when we get to the Daf 50. So, who needs to do zimun? Basically, a big preoccupation of the page is going to be whether the minimum is 3 people, but there's a debate whether 2 people could possibly also not necessarily be required, but be allowed to do zimun. And then the second thing is which people. The Mishnah talks about women, for example, and it says the women can do their own zimun, but they can't mix it up, so to speak. It would seem, at least, that we don't mix them up with men. And that's a good question. There's a halachic discussion where we can talk about what the halacha is on that, or various opinions of the halacha on that. And they actually can join in the zimun with men. Let me be very clear. They can join. The question only is in halacha, and there's different sides there's an ongoing debate whether they can be, let's say, part of the 3 to allow you to have the 3. And then, of course, what food? The Mishnah is going to tell us a kezayis, which is a little less, let's just say it's a little less than an ounce of bread. What about types of food, like foods that have some halachic consideration? The Mishnah is going to outline what is okay and what isn't okay. And what about after the zimun? Is there a requirement that the person who led the zimun, who led the invitation, should read out the entire benching or some of the benching? So that's also discussed. And what's the difference between 3 and 10? The basic difference is when you have 10, you say Elokeinu, you say God's name. And you don't do that with 3 until 10. And then there's going to be a discussion, a little bit on our daf, but more to come on 50, about starting, ending. Do you have to start and end together? Can you just end together or just start together? What happens when a group wants to disband? So this daf talks a little bit about that. And we're not going to cover that much of that today, but it's definitely there. And a broader discussion about the setup of the room, meaning we already learned you have to be sitting down or reclining. When they used to recline, now it's sitting at the same table. What about different rooms, but they're like in the same restaurant with the same waiter, meaning you usually have to be in the same room, you have to see each other. Are there exceptions to that? And we're going to do that, not today, but we'll get to that. And that's a little bit of the outline. So that's number 1, just kind of know what we're going into. A lot of the things I touched on are mentioned in the Mishnah or discussed amongst the Rishonim and the Achronim. So with that as a background, I'll just read a couple lines of the Mishnah to you. The Mishnah says, Shlosha she'achlu ka'achas, 3 people eating together, the bread, are obligated to join in this invitation to have call to order for bracha mazon. Let me just say, I'm not going to explain everything right from the get-go. As we go through this daf and additional dafim of Gemara in this chapter of Shosha She'achlu, about the 3 who eat together that are required to do bracha mazon, we're going to cover many elements and many aspects of what it is. But let's just mention a few things that we already learned about before we add on additional information. We already learned before that there's a level of mindful commitment to a conclusion of a meal that marks the halachic end of the meal, that would require one to, technically speaking, have to go back and make another bracha, or perhaps even wash on the Netilas Yadayim, ritually wash their hands, in order to pick up eating again. So there's a variety of opinions of things that happen towards the end of a meal as signposts or signals that the meal is concluded. That's significant because when we talk about brachot, we talk about hesech hadat or dat, which means what's being covered, so to speak, by the bracha, and where does the bracha end? And the mind does a lot of that. So one of the things that we talked about earlier is that when you begin the zimun process, that's a very clear line in the sand that the eating part of the meal is now concluded. And if you would want to change your mind, it's just that. You're really changing your mind. You're going back on a commitment to now not just have finished, but to go into the bracha mazon. So that's one thing we already learned. Another thing that we're going to talk about is the idea of hachana or hazmana, which means hechinu es atzmechem. The Torah tells us in a variety of times and places, prepare yourself. Prepare yourself. We're going to be reading Parshat Yisro, Matan Torah. Prepare yourself for 3 days, right? On the 3rd day, God is going to descend on the mountain. So wash your clothing. The commentaries say that would include also going to the mikvah, and a variety of things that a person would do in anticipation and to get ready for something spectacular. So in a sense, the simplest understanding of zimun is just that. You're about to do a mitzvah. It's a biblical mitzvah of when you eat v'achalta v'savata uverachta. You eat and you're satisfied. It's talking about bread. Uverachta. You'll bless God. So instead of just doing it, prepare yourself, get yourself ready for it. We're going to talk about why this mitzvah is different than any other mitzvah, because any other mitzvah, you just do the bracha. The bracha is kind of the intention. And here, the benching itself is a bracha, and yet you're making a bracha on the bracha. The Hazmana is considered by many to be like a bracha. So you're making a bracha to make a bracha. It seems a little strange. And we're going to actually do a little beautiful section of the Zohar on that. That's quoted in amongst other places, the Aruch Hashulchan, meaning it's the greatness of God with me, meaning the 2 of you join me, that's a total of 3 people, in our proclamation of God's greatness. So the concept, what we're dealing with here is that on a simplistic reading of the Talmud, the biblical verse, Gadol Hashem iti in Arom Moshe Mayachtav, is kovea, establishes an obligation to do zimun. which is actually a debate amongst the Rishonim whether it's a biblical obligation or perhaps it's just a rabbinic obligation. And the verse is what we call an asmachta. It's a support. Many times the rabbis quote biblical verses, and that biblical verse, it's not its actual meaning, the context of the reason or purpose of what they're bringing that verse for, but it supports an idea. Okay, so that's one verse. And another verse, Ravad says, the same concept. When I call out to God, the name of God, ascribe, plural, greatness to our God. So it's one person calling out to other people, at least to other people, to ascribe greatness to God. So that's the idea of the concept of zimun. It's a great concept, and there's a lot of call and response times in the synagogue. And Rabbi Akiva will note in a debate in a coming Mishnah on 49 that if you want to learn out certain details of the laws of zimun from verses, there has to be a certain equivalence to the synagogue experience, meaning it's similar in some sense. It's not really something that we need to discuss in detail here, but it's just to note that. So that is number 2, which is this kind of biblical proof text that may give the zimun a raisa, a biblical kiyum of fulfilling a biblical mitzvah. That is a very much minority opinion. The majority opinion is it is midirabanan. It is a rabbinic enactment, and the verses, as I said, are just an asmachta, but they're not meant to give it biblical status. Okay, that's number 2. Now we're going to get to, we're just warming up here, and we're going to get to the amazing number 3. Number 3 is a little bit of agadata, a wonderful, powerful message here. The Talmud, in this context, while it's discussing this zimun, it transitions into a brief digression, for lack of a better word, and says the following thing, that Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi says, how do we know? There used to be somebody in the synagogue who was a mitargem. His job, nowadays in some synagogues, the rabbi will say over a minute between the different aliyot. But there used to be a specific job where there was somebody who would say over the entire verse, one verse at a time, after the Torah reading. Obviously it would take a lot longer, in Aramaic. He wouldn't make it up. It was already kind of translated into what the equivalent we have today is called the Targum Onkelos, could be found on almost any chumash. So how do we know that person doing this kind of translation, this Aramaic translation, that it's not fit for him to raise his voice louder than the Torah reader? She'ne'amar, as it's stated in the verse, Moshe yidaber v'elokim ya'anenu b'kol. Moshe would speak, and God would respond to him in his voice. She'ein ta'am l'amar b'kol. What is it coming to tell you? B'kol shel Moshe. He would respond with the same level of voice as Moshe. Now Tosfos right away asks, we're trying to bring a proof text to tell us that the translator, the equivalent of the translator, can't or shouldn't lift his voice higher than the actual Torah reader. But the verse actually, and we're saying that God would respond to Moshe in kind. The only problem is that Moshe isn't seemingly the interpreter. This is talking about the Ten Commandments. We're going to be reading the Ten Commandments this week. Most authorities hold that other than the first, maybe the second commandment, they were given to, which we all heard. The other commandments, the other 8 or 9 commandments were given to Moses, and Moses then told, we heard it from Moses at Sinai, but only Moses heard it directly from God. But the problem is that Elokim Yanenu B'Kol, if we're going to assume for a moment that Moses is the interpreter, it doesn't fit into the actual text, because it doesn't create a proof text to prove the Talmud's point, because it says God is responding in like measure to Moses. The problem with that is that would mean that God is Moses' interpreter. Tosfos actually rejects that and explains that Moses is the interpreter and God is the originator of the biblical 10 Commandments. Yet God had to kind of even though God was only speaking to. So Tosfos has a good question, and the Meshach likes the question. He's just not thrilled with the answer. And what he actually does is says, no. The Talmud's point is clear. God is the interpreter of Moses. In other words, Moses was the one speaking, and God was helping us internalize what Moses said. What Moses said were ideas, words. God is the one that opened up our hearts so that it should enter into us, that until today we're still connected to the Torah. Now, I might think that since Moses is a human being and God is God and he's infinite, that God's kind of interpretation or allowing our hearts to receive it would be so much greater than Moses. Comes the Talmud and tells us, no. God didn't want to just blow out Moses and just say, Moses is a cute guy, but me, I'm going to give this to you. It's going to be 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times, infinite more, better, deeper than Moses. He created a certain, I don't want to say uniformity is not the right word, but equilibrium, so that his ability to inspire people didn't surpass the level that Moses was giving them that teaching in. There's 2 ways to learn this. There's the way the Ishbitz himself explains it, which is that because God limited us to never outshine Moses, and had he decided to give us his full infinity, so to speak, we would at certain points surpass Moses, and he didn't want that. That's the Meshach's own interpretation. I'd like to suggest something a little bit different than that, which is there's a idea that God only creates a world in which there's a certain humanity to our beings, meaning we're not angels. His transformation is limited in that he doesn't want us to become something else. He wants us to be who we really are. So just like when Moses speaks, it doesn't really make us into something else. Even God speaking and interpreting and internalizing, it doesn't make us eis mensch. It doesn't take us out of our humanity. We have to be within the confines of our menschlichkeit, of who we are as human beings. There's, one of the beautiful things that the Alter Rebbe of Chabad and Rabbi Nachman of Breslov both say in their own unique ways is that it wouldn't be a chiddush, it wouldn't be anything amazing for us to only experience divine oneness and unity. Because after all, that was how things were initially. There was Ein Sof Shalifnei Tzimtzum, which means there was infinite light. We are one wasn't just a word that was used by the Federation as their best ever appeal. for the couple of years that they used that slogan. It was we were one. There was only unity. The chiddush is that we're pulled apart from each other, and God, so to speak, kaviyachol, concealed his infinite light into and created a space where within that space we as human beings, with all of our contradictions and all of our issues and distractions and shenanigans, within that framework we can extend our vessels and open ourselves up to a little bit of light, but not to be overwhelmed by the light so we're ice mensch that we don't have the vessels. So that's my understanding of the Ishbitzer. Is V'Hashem Yanena Bakol, is that even though God could blow our minds, of course, and transform us and make us tzaddikim gemorim, he chooses not to. He chooses to be like the voice of the Koreh, of the Torah reader, which is Moses. God also, so to speak, disguises himself within the framework of tzimtzum, of confinement, to be able to limit his revelation so that we could be who we are. Because it's very hard. A lot of times, one of the great ma'ilot of the Baal Shem Tov and his students and the students is that he taught people to love who they are, to work from the framework of who they are. Before that, there were people who really literally hated who they were. They didn't understand that the Yetzer Hara and the Nefesh HaBahamiyut, the animalistic impulses, serve a vital function. Of course, they can go bad. Of course, they need to be honed and transformed to some level. But you can't hate who you are. You have to work from the framework of where you are and who you are. So that's number 3, about God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as the interpreter and Moshe as the Torah reader. Number 4 is what the Yerushlmis says about a machlokus in the Bavli. It's about the Bavli and the Yerushlmis is so interesting. If you wanted to look at the Bavli, at least one amud, not in starting at the middle of 45a, going into the middle of 45b, is dedicated to this one question, a machlokus about if two people broke bread together, so to speak, if they're not required to do zimun, but if they're allowed to do zimun. That's a question, as a machlokus. So the Yerushalmi gives the rationale, the rationale that the Yerushalmi gives is that there is already a debate, I believe it's in Sanhedrin. We know that it says that to have a Biet Din, you need 3 people. There's a bigger Biet Din as well, but you need a minimum of 3 people. What happens if you had a Biet Din and for whatever reason they only had 2 people, the third person just didn't show? And they said, hey, why don't we have a Biet Din with 2 people? So one opinion says you shouldn't do it, but if they did, dinehem din, their judgment is the law. And the other opinion says, ein dinehem din, that there is no Biet Din of less than 3. There is a concept of a yachid mumcha, an extraordinary person like a Moses figure, but let's leave that aside. Normal dayanim, you need to have 3. So that's a machlokus. So the Yerushalmi wants to suggest that the yisod of the machlokus, I would say, presumably, the machlokus is the same in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, just we don't offer a reason in the Bavli, is, do we say that it's like you need 3, like a Biet Din of 3, of that opinion? Or do you say like the other opinion that a Biet Din should have 3, but doesn't need to have 3, it could have 2? Let's look deeper about why do you need 3 for a Biet Din versus 2? So, one of the reasons when you have 3 is that, I'll give you an example, is there is a type of basin called Ze Bar Lo Echad, the Ze Bar Lo Echad, where each of the litigants pick a dayan, and then the 2 dayanim, the 2 judges that were picked, will then approach a third dayan, And those three dayanim will hear the case between, Reuben and Shimon, and they'll rule on it. And in the Shulchan Aruch and the Nosei it's they should do, of course, what's right, but they like, so they'll do a decent job. They're not gonna, they'll fight on your behalf within the framework of halacha. They're not gonna cheat for you and lie for you, but within the framework of halacha. And so will the other person. So each the other dayan. So each of the people in the court case that brought it down will feel like, I know this rabbi. This rabbi is going to do a good job. He's not going to let me down, because he's, again, within the framework of what's permitted. The third dayan becomes almost like the true judge, who really sees both sides of the story and then has to really pick which one makes the most sense, which one is the emet la'amito, is the true truth, not just a partial truth, because he doesn't have the biases that may be contained in the eyes of the dayanim that were selected by the litigants. So perhaps what you could say is that gets back to the root of what is Hazmana, what is the root of zimun, of an invitation. It's not two people, it's three people. It's like and that's one thing. Like you have representation of two sides. Like, who's going to make peace in this country? It's not going to be a Republican or a Democrat. It's going to be somebody who both sides could look up to and respect. That's the person who's going to make the peace. So that's one way of looking at why we would need three. And that's the halacha, by the way. You need three. You can't do two. Two, you got to bench on your own. You can't do zimun even as a nice thing. So that's the Yerushlmi. I think it offers insight into the Bavli, even though the Yerushlmi's quoting that is not quoted in the Bavli. Okay, number 5. The Mishnah says that in the following cases you don't do zimun. For example, what are the cases that you don't do zimun? You don't do this a precursor to the benching, the Hazmana invitation to benching. Meiser Tevel, Meiser Rishon Shaloni L'Trumaso, Meiser Sheni V'Hekta Shaloniftu, V'Hasham V'Shachol Pachas M'Gazayis, V'Anachri, Eim Zam Malav. Basically, when you have bread and you didn't tithe it, you didn't do the things that would make it the equivalent of kosher today. It's interesting, in America, there's a lot of things that are not kosher that would be kosher in Israel, but it's sometimes the reverse. When you go to Israel, when it comes to produce, there's trumos and maestros, there's shvius, there are laws that apply more to Israel than they do to the rest of the world, and those are the things that the Mishnah is saying. You didn't take care of these things, you can't do zimun. The question is, what about the bracha hamazon itself? Can you do the bracha hamazon if you ate tavel or meiser, whatever? You ate these things that you shouldn't have eaten. That's one question. What about a bracha rishona, the bracha before? Can you make that? So that's the second question. So there's a huge, famous argument between the Rambam and the Ravad. The Ravad said, the Rambam doesn't know what he's talking about. The Rambam says that any bracha that you make on food, before or after, is not made if there's a halachic major problem with the food. Let's say the food is not kosher. I assume if the food is stolen even. But definitely all the categories that are listed in the Mishnah here that says you wouldn't do the zimun on, you would not make a bracha or bracha hamazon on either. The Ravad totally disagrees. He says the fact that the Mishnah says you don't do zimun on means it's limited to specifically zimun, but the other brachot you would make. The truth is, I was looking at the Aruch Hashulchan. There's a very wide array of proofs to back up the Rambam. There's a Tosefta, there's a Mishnah and Demai, there's Yerushlmi, there's Mashmos and various Gemaras that the Rambam is right. But, this leads us to a bigger question. This conversation is often broadly categorized with a concept called mitzvah haba ba'avera. Not necessarily, because the meaning of that is a good deed that comes out of a sin. So, for example, the classic is lulav hagazul, a stolen lulav. There's a whole conversation about a stolen sukkah, and then you have a stolen shofar, and then you have a stolen matzah for Pesach, and the Mishnayot and the Gemara and the Halacha deal extensively with this broader category of mitzvah haba ba'avera and the more specific category of various verses that seem to indicate about specific individual mitzvot that shouldn't be done under certain circumstances if there's something wrong or illicit somehow with the product. Now, one of the questions that often comes up is if there's a mitzvah haba ba'avera is a catch-all for any mitzvah that comes through, any mitzvah that comes out of an avera, why do we need a variety of psukim, not so much here, but in other places, to bolster this idea in a variety of times? Usually there's a concept is you say it once, it applies everywhere. So I think Tosfos and Sukkah and Baba Kama, I believe, says, well, mitzvah haba ba'avera itself isn't necessarily biblical prohibition, it's a rabbinic prohibition. Therefore, when there's another Torah prohibition, when the Torah specifies that it's not allowed, then it's not allowed. But if the Torah doesn't specify, the rabbis have an issue with it, but it doesn't necessarily knock it out. So there are these halachic conversations. There's a Minchas Chinuch about mitzvah haba ba'avera. There has to be an intrinsic connection of the avera to the fulfillment of the mitzvah. They can't just be slightly related. And there's a lot of conversations about this. It's one of the most beautiful Tosfos is on this in Sukkah and Baba Kama. Really complicated, really beautiful. But I want to suggest something else, which is something that is just a mind-blowing concept. It's based on the Meshilach. Basically, the Meshilach says, look, this is like think of the mitzvah as like medicine, okay? And when you do a mitzvah, it's treating something in your soul. And the thing that it's treating is like medicine, it's also blocking something bad from happening, or it's enabling you to stop that bad thing from happening within your life. And I'm not necessarily talking about magic here. I'm talking about very specifically the mitzvah. For you to fulfill that particular mitzvah, there's a prerequisite that you don't do something that will mess up that mitzvah. So, for example, when it comes to a lulav, there's a prerequisite that you don't steal the lulav. But let's go a little deeper. Comes to Meshulach and says, it's not just that you don't steal the lulav. To really fulfill the mitzvah of taking the lulav, you can't steal. Period. Otherwise, it's somehow impinging on the purity of the lulav. Okay, the lulav represents what's yours, like really owning what's yours and not taking what isn't in life. So in that case, it's not so much a mitzvah haba ba'avera, the catch-all thing. We don't want to do a mitzvah that comes through a sin. That may be or not. But what is that every particular mitzvah, the Gemara, not every mitzvah, but many mitzvah, the Gemara talks about what are some of the criterias of some avera that will, by doing the avera in the context of the mitzvah, not allow you to access the inner purpose of the mitzvah. So with that, you can answer many, many questions in many, many different sections of Shas, where the questions would be asked. Why does this particular time, like we learned in Psachim, different limudim, different things about what you can't or use for matzah. Why does it need to have all those variety of psukim to teach us things that should just be part of a catch-all? The answer is that it's not part of a catch-all because each mitzvah has its own unique qualities of what it's like a medicine. You got to read the label of your medicine to find out what it goes with, what it doesn't go with, what the purpose of it is, what it's going to do to heal you, and what will hold that healing back, so to speak. So it's a psychological process that the mitzvah is a part of and will be blocked when you block it, so to speak. So let's take a look at here, this idea of Hazmana, the Ravad. Let's defend the Ravad for a moment. Yes, there are many proofs that the Aruch Hashulchan and others quote to bolster the Rambam. And the Rambam is quoted in Shulchan Aruch, don't get me wrong. We probably follow the Rambam, the Maisa, in most cases. There's a debate how far the Rambam goes. But let's take a deeper look here at the Ravad. The Ravad is making a diuk. He's reading this Mishnah very specifically as limiting the zimun, but not the bracha hamazon or the bracha itself, the bracha shlifnei ha'achila, before the eating. What would the difference be when I'm making a bracha? When you're making a bracha, every bracha is a matir. Matir means it's allowing something that wasn't allowed until this moment. You're making a bracha, it's allowing you to do a mitzvah, and if it's a bracha mitzvah, it's allowing you to partake of a food, if it's a bracha hanenin. The bracha achrona, the zimun for the bracha achrona is unique. It doesn't fit into a matir. Why do you need a matir to do a? You're not doing anything. You're making a bracha. The bracha is its own matir, the bracha hamazon. So it has to be a new category of hachana. We talked about before the idea of zimun as hazmana or hachana, meaning preparedness. So the whole idea of preparedness is a concept of kavanah. It is kavanah. It is about intentionality. It is about intent versus action, not just doing, stopping to think about what you're doing, planning it out, preparing yourself, making it meaningful. So perhaps the uniqueness, so to speak, a bracha is a bracha. You make a bracha. The bracha is a matir to whatever it is that you're doing. Maybe there's some sveikot, so to speak. There's some issues in a object that you're eating. Maybe the kashrus is not 100%. Maybe you're eating a little bit of, a treif sandwich, but the bread is kosher, perhaps. The sandwich isn't. So maybe it's a taruvot, so to speak. It's a mixture. So of course, you shouldn't eat it, of course, but the fact is there's some part of it that might not be really 100% treif. Maybe that the bracha covers that, whether it's the bracha rishon or the bracha achrona covers that. But when it comes to the hazmana, when it comes to like doing hachanot, it's a ruchniasika thing. It's a spiritual thing. There you have to be more careful. So that would be my defense, my Ishbitzer defense of the Ravad in number 5. Number 6 is once we're already dealing with Hasidus, let's do something from the Zohar. But what's beautiful here is, and one of the things I'm trying to do, sometimes I go a little bit off and talk about Kabbalah and Hasidus. I'm trying not to, I just can't help myself. I'm really trying, the goal, though I don't always do it, is to give a shir on Gemara that uses Zohar or Hasidus as any other pirush. Like it has to fit into the Gemara. I'm not looking to take it away from the Gemara. I know I'm not perfect. I sometimes kind of don't stick to that idea, but I would like to. So, that's my goal, to bring it closer to the pshat in the Gemara, or at least it doesn't have to be pshat, it has to be a pshat, it has to give meaning to the Gemara. It doesn't have to be the only pshat or the pshuto of the Gemara, but it has to be something that resonates with the Gemara. So here's one, because this whole idea of the Hazmana just begs the question, why do we even need it? I mean, I know we have those psukim that we've talked about in number 3, God Hashem iti and Mashmayachta, but again, like I said, the majority of opinion says that's not the actual meaning of the psukim. They're just an asmachta. So what is it really about? So the Zohar says the following thing. It's in Parshas Balak or it's more famously known as the Yenuka. It's a beautiful story in the Zohar about a little boy who was basically challenging the students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, telling them they weren't so holy, and he was saying they didn't wash their hands when one of them made a bracha before washing the hands instead of after, and he said you shouldn't be doing that. And let me actually pull out the Zohar here. So excuse me if I read a little bit too much, but there's a real important point. And as I mentioned, the Aruch Hashulchan quotes the Zohar in a halachic context to help us understand it. First of all, the Aruch Hashulchan says there's two reasons why we say Rabbos Mevel Benchen. The Gemara here doesn't quote that. The Gemara here is really more preoccupied with Nivarech She'achanu Mishalo, Baruch She'achanu Mishalo V'tuva Chayinu, or God's name, Baruch Elokeinu She'achanu Mishalo V'tuva Chayinu. That's what our Gemara is more preoccupied with. The Aruch Hashulchan quotes a Gemara in Psachim that says Habla Minivarech. The equivalent of it is Rabbi Mevel Bench in the Yiddish, gentlemen or honored people. Let's get ready to make a blessing. So the Zohar says this. Amru Havan Varech. They said, let's bench. At that time, it was like, let's prepare a cup. Let's pour a cup of wine for the Brachos Hamazon. You're supposed to do the Brachos Hamazon over a cup of wine, and let's bench. So the Yenuka said to the men there, good. Ya'os amrason begin to shma kadisha lo misbarach b'bracha da ela b'hazmana. So you did good by saying Hava Nevarech, because the name of the Holy One, blessed be He, is not blessed in this bracha, which is either the Brachos Hamazon or perhaps, as we'll see later, the statement itself of Nevarech She'achanu Mishalo. That itself is considered a bracha, especially with Elokeinu, but even without Elokeinu. So then, basically, what the Yenuka explained to the Chavraya Kadisha that were there, that every time you sit down, every time you deal with something like food, there's a battle going on. The battle between the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, or as it calls it, the Sitra Akra, or the Samach Mem, different names that the Zohar gives it. What's the battle? Now, we talked about before the bracha on Brachos Hanenin, the bracha on a food as a matir, permitting you to access the food. Why? Because the food is tied down in the hands of the Sitra Akra for a variety of reasons. There's a concept called Arla, Ravad, right? Which means the first 3 years. The fourth year, the Zohar quotes that concept, but it means a broader thing here. It doesn't mean the halachic issue of actual Arla. It just means because the physical world, we're so close to it and we enjoy it so much, there's always a fear that we may fall into the klipa, into the kind of the unholy part of the physical world. Whether it's because, b'derech she'adam holech, the pathway that a person is going into, that's the way that God will let them be led into. So if I start being very gluttonous, even if it's kosher, I may then be tempted to keep going and eat non-kosher, and so on and so forth, like in life. There's different ways of looking at it. So by saying the bracha, I'm like activating the spiritual in the food. Saying I want to recognize that there's divine energy. Lo al alechem levado yichya adam. It's not on the bread alone, but on the Devar Hashem, the Motzi Pi Hashem, which the Zohar and the Ari and the Baal Shem Tov all talk about, is the bracha is invoking the Dvar Hashem in the bread, the spiritual energy in the bread. So that's the bracha Rishona. But the bracha Achrona is a little more complicated, the Birkat HaMazon. So therefore, it needs a Hazmana. Usually the bracha is, here's the object, the Hachana is I'm about to eat the object, the food item, and I make a bracha, and that activates the good relationship with it. So in the Birkat HaMazon, it's a little bit different. You don't have an object, even though you have a cup of wine, but you already drank a cup of wine, so we're not clear that it's really, it becomes kosher bracha, but we don't really know that, the Zohar says. But the concept here is you need to do, it's the only time when you're doing a hachana on a hachana, because a bracha is a little bit of a preparation itself. But here the bracha is no longer preparation, at least the Birkat HaMazon. It is the thing. And we need to create, but we need to do it with kavanah. So we need the zimun to do that, and we need the hazmana on the zimun as well, which the Zohar talks about. Okay, so that's a little bit about number 6. It's a beautiful Zohar. I can't do any more of it, and because it is a Talmud class, not a Zohar class. Number 7 is women and zimun. So basically, what I'm going to say is there's a machlokas rishonim whether women are obligated to do zimun if they're on their own. And some say they are obligated, others say they're not obligated, they can if they want to. The Aruch Hashulchan says in our days we don't see women for the most part doing zimun on their own. By the way, it's not necessarily true. Maybe he speaks for his own community. It's true. I'm not arguing with him in terms of what he sees. But there are places, there are religious women who do zimun. Maybe not consistently, but they definitely do it. So now there's a question about 2 questions: whether they should say Elokeinu, and it seems like they halachically they halachically are from what I've seen is that they don't, but it's a question. They don't, but there seems to be 1 or 2 sources that actually say why not. But I guess since there's a machlokus about it, the assumption is that they should not. The second thing is, can they add up to the 3 or the 10 with men? And Lamaisa, most people don't. But the truth is, there is a halachic source that would allow for that to be explored. So, you ask your Rav of your community, and I assume in a Haredi community the answer is going to be no, they can't be added. But in a modern Orthodox community, it's an evolving question. It has a source in halacha. It's not just some innovation thing that nobody ever wrote about 100 and 500 years ago. There is a discussion about it. And some Rabbanim today, modern Orthodox Rabbanim, are re-exploring these sources and saying perhaps you could be mitzdaref men and women under certain circumstances to zimun. Again, you're not going to hear this in the yeshiva world, so that is what it is. So that's a little bit about number 7, women and zimun. Number 8, the Gemara explains, since women don't they're not part of a minyan, so why do they have either an obligation or allowance to do zimun that we mentioned before? So the Gemara introduces this concept called Daos. Daos means they have minds, opinions, meaning it doesn't go by just the halachic standard of what would normally be a minyan of men or 3 men. It has its own category of Daos. So what is this thing about Daos? So there's a few ways to look at it. One way is, as we already talked about in the Yerushlmis in number 4, the concept of learning out to some degree zimun from a Biet Din. 3 represents 3 opinions, or as the Meshaloch says, when you have 3, it's like a Biet Din of 3. It's impossible that one of the 3 didn't learn. Somebody learned. Between the 3 of them, they're going to know something. So that's one way of looking at it. 3 people, 3 men, 3 women. It doesn't matter. They're going to have some interesting complexities to the group that allows them to bring out this Hazmana. But the Meshulach goes a little deeper and says the following. Whatever, doesn't do it. You, me, and the third person is when you see two different people, you say, wow, these people are so different, and yet there's something like so familiar or so connected on the soul level, even though they're the polar opposites. Somehow the Ishbitzer sees in opposites unity, because he somehow sees like even the most distant extremes, they have some meeting of minds. Perhaps it's because, like we said before, when you have three people, you have three opinions, but perhaps the middle opinion is the machriya, is the person who can see a little bit of Hillel and Shammai, and like we say, when you have a contradiction in two verses, until the third verse comes and mediates between the seeming contradiction and reconciliation. So in the three opinions, you have reconciliation, you have tiferet, you have different elements that allow you to see a certain complexity that ultimately is more of a divine thing than just one or two people. That's finished. Can the two say, well, we're going to do the zimun now, and please answer, and the third person will have to stop eating, and he'll have to answer, and then after he listens to some part of the benching, he could go back eventually to his meal. So that is the halacha, by the way. That's what we do. That's the etiquette. That's what we do. What about if one of them finished eating and he wants to do the zimun, the other two are still in the middle of eating? So the Gemara says, no. The etiquette is we don't stop the two from the middle of their meal to do the zimun. Because by the way, the zimun back then, I didn't really talk about this enough, wasn't just the Rabosim Rav mentioned that the Hishem, Hashem, all that stuff. It was also they would bench together. The leader would bench the whole thing. Then later on, they would bench at least the first paragraph. Today, most people don't really do the reading together. Maybe the first paragraph, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch says we should still do even though that's not the custom, it would still be the right thing to do the first paragraph where the leader reads it for everyone else listens. But be that as it may, back then it was a major interruption of the meal. So having one person wanting to bench, making the others interrupt their meal for a long time was considered inconsiderate. But the Gemara asks on that, we see there's a story where a father was with his son and a friend, and the son was ready to go, and the father and the friend were still in the middle of the meal, and yet the father interrupted his meal to allow his son to do the zimun. The Gemara asks, so we see that it's not necessarily that only one interrupts his meal for two, even two could interrupt their meal for one. So the Gemara says, no, that's different. Rav Papa, who's the rabbi who interrupted his meal with his friend in order for his son to bench, he did lefnim mishur sadin. He went beyond the letter of the law. I mean, look at the beauty of that. It was his son. Look at the kavod. Usually we have stories in the Talmud about respecting your parents. Here it's such a beautiful story about Rav Papa respecting his son. To me, it's very touching, very beautiful. Okay, so that's number 9. Number 10 is another story of 3 rabbis who didn't do zimun. Crazy, right? Why would 3 rabbis not do zimun? Well, the story is, I'll read it inside. Yehuda, Bar Maremar, Marbar Rav Ashi, Rav Achamadifti were ate bread together. Now, there wasn't somebody who was muflog mechaber. There wasn't anyone more better in learning than the others. They're all equals. Now, part of the zimun is usually the head of the chabur, the head of the group, leads the zimun. There's a Kohen, it's the Kohen. If there's a Rav, it's the Rav. It's a father, it's a father. Of course, you could give permission to somebody who's not the head, but it goes first. That's a whole other conversation who to give it to. But let's just assume for now it goes to the head. There's no head. So they said, you know what? There's no head. They thought that the zimun is when there's a clear person to lead, then they lead. There's no clear person to lead. They just bench on their own. So they all 3 bench on their own. And then they were wondering, they knew it might be a problem. So they went to find out if they had done the right thing. And they asked one of their rabbis, did we do the right thing? And he answered, Maremar. He said, yeah, well, Yidei bracha yatzasam. You fulfilled your obligation to do bracha Hamazon, Yidei zimun lo yatzasam, but you did not fulfill your requirement to do the invitation to the blessing. And if you say, let's go back and do it again, ain zimun l'mafreya. You can't do the zimun after the fact, meaning once you do the benching. So let me just explain it for a minute. What's going on? I mean, even today we all know that zimun is zimun. It doesn't, why would you not do zimun if you're all equal? Because back then, zimun, it was as important that they bench together, and the leader of whoever did the zimun would lead the benching and the others would just listen. So they thought that maybe that was the whole thing. If you don't have that, there's no need. There's no need for one of them to lead it because they're all equal. They could all read it on their own. So they didn't understand that as important as that is, it isn't zimun per se. Zimun per se is you do the hazmana, and then you also lead the rest of the benching. But it's not because of leading the benching that you need somebody to lead it and the other people need to follow. It's not always about leading and following. It's also about, getting ready, having one person say the zimun, and then, they'll also lead. But the benching needs a zimun, and that was an important lesson. And the bottom line is that's what we do today. Today we don't do so much. We do zimun and we do bracha Hamazon, but we don't integrate them fully the way they used to, where the person doing the zimun would literally be the one who would do the benching for everyone else. Everyone else would only listen to them. So that's a little bit of the top 10 of the Talmud for Brachos 45.